Good evening, welcome to my presentation on the 3 pillars of effective marking and feedback. Sorry I couldn't be there this evening, but unfortunately it's a rather long way from Kent. But hopefully I can still share with you a few takeaway ideas on making marking more manageable. So what's the issue with marking? Well, I've run this presentation as a workshop several times, and each time I ask this question it's always the same issues that seem to arise. Usually the top comment is time. The next being the effort put in by the teachers versus the impact on student progress. And finally, the feeling that all too often marking is a tick-boxing exercise. But really, should it be this way? Marking should be an opportunity for us to build on our students' understanding and plan appropriately. Far too often, though, the expected provision of feedback just doesn't allow for that, and that needs to change. Now, time for you to do some thinking. Why do we mark? What is the purpose of marking for you and your students? Why do we do it? Here's an opportunity for you to share your reasons on Twitter with the hashtag #TMRochdale. For me, marking is the basis of my planning. Knowing where my students are enables my planning for the next lesson or a series of lessons. When you teach so many classes, year groups or subjects, how can we stay on top of this? How can we ensure that the lessons we're planning are for the students in front of us? So this is where the 3 pillars of effective marking and feedback come in. These have originated from the Independent Teacher Workload Review and their report on eliminating unnecessary workload around marking. When the review was published last year, there were 3 core elements that I took from it. That marking should be made meaningful, manageable and motivating. And that means not just for our students but for us as well. Which got me thinking about why I mark and assess the way that I do and how could I make it work even better for me. Some of the core points that arose as I read the report were, if I'm acknowledging my pupils' work, does that necessarily need written comments? And checking their outcomes, again, do I need to write in their books? If marking is meant to help me to make decisions about my students and how they should progress, can I use the time for planning instead of spending these unaccountable hours documenting what my students have achieved, what they could do next to progress and how they could do that? Personally, I think we need to move away from an extensive written dialogue system and move towards a system where feedback in whatever form it is given is trusted. Whilst it might be of concern to many leaders that if we reduce the quantity of marking, then we're going to reduce the quality. But I really feel we shouldn't have to fear this. I've tried numerous approaches and I've still maintained high quality feedback for my students. The following slides are a few ideas from my marking and feedback toolkit. I've been trying numerous techniques over the last 3.5 years, and these are the ones that I use on a regular basis. I've got to the point now where I think I've just about managed to make my Key Stage 3 marking meet the 3 pillars. Now it's time to master it for Key Stage 4 and 5. Let's have a look at what I've done then. This first technique, the whole class feedback, has probably been the one that's most revolutionised the time I actually spend marking, assessing and feeding back to my students. I quite simply go through a set of books and look for recurring errors and write these in the relevant sections of the sheet. Next, I'll highlight any names of exceptional effort in the praise frame, along with any particular comments related to double ticks and single ticks. Finally, I look for steps that my students can take to push themselves forward. Usually I will give specific tasks or questions that relate to a code that I write in the student's book. To acknowledge successes in the work, I quite simply double tick or single tick. I then simply scan and project this sheet on the whiteboard for my students to see. They'll then spend about 20 to 30 minutes of the lesson writing down and acting on feedback. Whilst it takes a bit of time in lesson to close the gap, it's really great because it does mean that I spend a mere 30 to 40 minutes assessing a whole set of books. The next one is the feedback grid, another of my favourites. I often use this when I'm given a piece of work that's an extended piece. It could be anything from an essay to a presentation or a group task. I give it to students in advance of them starting the work so that they're aware of the success criteria. And this allows me to have discussions with my students as they work. I carry 2 highlighters with me around my classroom and highlight the achievements in one colour and the steps to improve in another. Once the student has completed the steps to improve, I simply tick it off and give verbal praise. It's particularly effective when I then come to marking the final pieces of work, because half the marking has been done for me. I just need to go through and clarify that they've met their next steps. The learning matrix. This was developed in my last school, where the school wanted students to know exactly where they were and what they could do to improve. In order to do this, I created what I call the learning matrix for each topic. On here, you would find a series of need-to-know questions and success criteria banded into bronze, silver and gold. Again, quite simply, I'd carry around 2 highlighters, and if students demonstrated evidence of the criteria, I'd highlight it in one colour, and if I felt they were not meeting their so-called flight path targets, I'd highlight it in another colour. Once they demonstrated their progress, it would be ticked off. And although this was time consuming to start with, it made marking and the provision of feedback significantly less time consuming. Marking codes I've used in combination with other feedback approaches, particularly the whole class feedback and the learning matrix. In terms of the learning matrix, each criteria had a code, B1, B2, B3. I'd simply identify the success in the piece of work by writing the corresponding code in the marking. At the end of the piece of work, I'd draw some steps and I'd write the codes for the students to then act upon. I'd also then leave the highlighting of the criteria to the students. Again, another job I didn't have to do. The double tick is a very easy approach, and I use this regularly. I quite simply double tick any particular skills or criteria met in the work. Sometimes I get a student to annotate, or I annotate it myself. Sometimes I'll tell students what the double ticks are for. Other times I leave it for them or their peers to try to work out and explain. In this example, the peer has double ticked, annotated and then given a reason for the double ticks at the end of the work. This is one I tend to use for acknowledging student successes. The annotations then are really simple, and they're used in order to avoid extended comments and excessive dialogue. I often use this approach with sixth form, to be honest, when marking their essays. They'll usually have to summarise their successes and steps for improvement at the end, which I think is the important part, ensuring that they actually understand the feedback that they've been given. Now, this is something I've been using more recently. ACE feedback. It's now one of my go-to techniques. It's really quite simple. During or at the end of a piece of work, students peer assess. They'll simply identify successes with double ticks, identify challenges or misconceptions with a question mark, and they will identify opportunities for extension with a star. In this example, the student has written originally in blue pen, their peer assessed in purple, and they acted upon the feedback in pink. This student was peer assessed midway through the task, giving them the opportunity to improve the start of their answer and to actually act upon the feedback during the rest of their answer. With sixth formers, I usually get them to ACE assess at the end of an essay, given time to improve and make improvements on what they've done already, and then they submit it. Space peer assessment is quite simply a step up on the ACE. It just adds in spelling, particularly great for the younger years. Now, student-determined marking. I personally do not feel we need to mark and assess everything, and sometimes it's better for the students to decide on what they are working towards and what they want marked. Therefore, on occasions, I use student-determined marking, both as a peer assessment and teacher assessment strategy. In the lower years, I give a list of skills for students to choose from, or I ask them to identify their marking focus based upon prior feedback. Students write then what they want assessed in the margin, and then I or their peers look for this in the work. Here's an example of the student-determined marking which is being peer assessed. You can see that the student has asked for their spelling, punctuation and grammar to be assessed in the margin. Their peer has assessed their spellings and left a kind comment and helpful comment at the end. You can then see that the student has then acted on this feedback by writing out the misspelt word in 3 sentences. The next lesson, they continued this piece of work and ensured that the spellings were correct. Finally, a well-used WW and EBI. This was one of the very first methods I used straight out of my PGCE, along with RAG ratings. I hated it, if I'm honest, but I've come back around to it with the addition of the I need to comment from the student. I felt WWW and EBI put too much of the emphasis on the teacher. You're essentially doing the thinking for the students. So the addition of the student writing their I need to comment turns the responsibility and ownership of the target back onto them. Well, I've shared with you a load of approaches, and now it's your turn to decide what's appropriate for you, your setting and your students. Hopefully you found something to take away and try, and hopefully make the move towards a more meaningful, manageable and motivating workload. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me via Twitter or email. Thanks for watching.